Hello, everyone, and welcome to Coffee with a Codex. Of course, you're used to seeing my wonderful friend and colleague, Dot Porter, who usually hosts these events, although Dot is away this month in Glasgow on fellowship, and she's actually joined us. So she is on the Zoom call, which is great in case we have any technical glitches, because Dot is the maestra of Coffee with a Codex, and the rest of us are just lowly pretenders. But I will do my best. We have a wonderful manuscript today to look at, LJS 27, which is a late 15th century arithmetic textbook that's absolutely fascinating. It's one of our most beloved items. I can't believe we haven't yet featured it on Coffee with a Codex. So I'm pleased to show it to you today. And this is LJS 27, so it's part of the Lawrence J. Schoenberg collection that came to us at Penn in the last decade or so. And it's a manuscript that has what appears to be an 18th century binding, a little bit worn. Surely very different from the original binding it might have contained, but you can see here that it has the Schoenberg book plate. It's got some marbled paste downs, thank you, Amy, for pasting in the catalog record in the chat, so you can go to that and look at the digital images later on if you wish to. Got some paper, some modern 18th or 19th century flyleaves. But as I mentioned, this book is a really remarkable one-off. No other copies of this text are known. It was never printed. It's a one-off sort of bespoke mathematical textbook for an adolescent, likely. It's sort of basic arithmetic, basic geometry is contained in this book. And it was likely created for a son or perhaps daughter of a merchant in order to learn the important kind of mathematical skills that were needed for commercial transactions of all kinds, involving various quantities, involving different currencies, involving different areas of fabric or of different weights of metals, things like that. So it's an object that really speaks to us today because it is, first of all, it's very readable. It's in Italian. We know the name of the scribe and likely the person who kind of authored the textbook, Pier Paolo Muscarello. And he signs this, and I'll show you this later on in a colophon at the end of the book with the date 1478. And he was from Nola, outside of Naples. We don't know a lot about Muscarello, but there is at least one other manuscript at McGill University, MS 139, that's signed by him. So we don't know much else about him at all. Surely there's more to learn about him in archives or in unpublished sources elsewhere. Someone asked in the chat when marbleized paste downs were first used. That's a good question. I mean, marble paper is used in the 16th century, especially in the Ottoman world. It has a long tradition there. So it was a fashion that was perhaps found occasionally in the 16th century, really gets started in the 17th century in Western European books, and by the 18th century and 19th century, this kind of de rigueur, you kind of a nice binding will very often have a marbled paste down. And this is marbled paper that's made with an oil-based medium that's floated a vat of water, and the paper, each sheet is uniquely placed on top of the floating oil to create these patterns. And you can, if you haven't seen that ever done in person, it's fantastic to watch. They're great YouTube videos about it. But this book, it begins sort of inauspiciously, I suppose, with a multiplication table. But we all know our multiplication tables, right? So down here we go from 1 to 0 through to 10. We have 2, 3, 4. So 4 times 5 is 20. And all the way through here to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is 100. 2 times 11 is 22. 2 times 12 is 24. Here we have a patch, which is interesting, to repair the parchment with perhaps original, but if not original, very early. Someone's written in 56, 63 and 70 for 7 times 8, 7 times 9, 7 times 10. So we've got these that continue, of course, the era before slide rule, the era before calculators. You know, the multiplication tables are all really kind of laboriously written out. Up to here we have 18 times 19, and then et cetera, and then 20 times 20, 400. So the decision was made to kind of stop with the table there. And then you have this shown in a different way. So 121 is 11 times 11, 144 is 12 times 12, et cetera, in a nice little table. 5,329, incidentally, is 73 times 73. So this manuscript, when it was owned by an Italian bank in 1972, there was a facsimile that was made of it in 2 volumes and an entire transcription of the whole text in Italian with all of the multiplication tables. And I can put a link. You can find that if you look up Algorithmus in Franklin, the name of this book, you'll find that facsimile as well. But I can also provide a link to that. And the commentary on that facsimile done in the 1970s mentions that some of the math, some of the arithmetic in the textbook is actually wrong. You know, in the pre-modern world, you know, things aren't necessarily always as regular. There's a few little minor errors in some of the multiplications and additions. So I don't know if we'll come across any of those, but it's interesting to know that. And being someone who was never particularly good at math myself, I kind of take comfort in that fact that even Pier Paolo Muscarello made some mistakes. So here we have just sort of the preliminaries about making sums, about subtracting, about multiplying and dividing, right? So this is mathematics. It's very familiar to us. And this is also sort of an index of what is to come further in the book. And I want to go to, you know, after these preliminary sections, we have a fairly grand, actually, sort of illuminated frontispiece. And a nice detail about this, and I can look at this, it's a bit fragile, but I'll show you very, very carefully, very gingerly, is that when this book was rebound, and I showed you that it has probably an 18th century binding, some care was taken, probably because this was the coat of arms. This is a coat of arms of the family that owned it, the Albertini family of Nola, outside of Naples. An eagle with a sort of red sash with white fleur-de-lis flowers. But I can show you that this is actually turned in, and you can see that the little feet of the puto and the bottom of this little garland are on this. I don't know if I would call it a turn-in. I think it might have a more specific name. I don't know if Amy or Dot can assist me, but this was done occasionally by very careful binders. When they were rebinding a book, they would fold in, sometimes it's done with notes, actually more commonly on the margins, turn it in before they planed down the edges of the book when they were rebinding it and cleaning it up to preserve that information, that in this case is visual information. It's gilded with, you know, gold leaf, a fairly simple palette, but a pretty nice sort of decorative scheme. This is clearly done by a professional illuminator, whereas the other images that we'll see in the book are perhaps not. We have wonderful scribal pen work here in 3 different colors, green, red, and a sort of purplish blue. And here we have a kind of extension here into the margin with a little rabbit. So it's kind of playful, which you would expect in a mathematical textbook. This little very kind of short preface is interesting because it talks about what Algorithmus, the name of this book, and you know, we have the word algorithm, of course, but Algorithmus as a kind of branch of mathematics. And here it says that we call it Algorithmus because this science was principally begun in Arabia, and the words come from the Arabic, which means algo means algo means art, and number rismus in Arabic. And this, I'm not sure if that's technically correct from a sort of philological point of view, but that's the argument that the author makes, explaining the name algoritmos. And the author's also sort of talking about the different branches. Talks first about sort of knowledge of God, which is the most important kind of knowledge, but also along with that, knowledge of things and mathematics. So it's kind of framing the kind of very lofty purpose of such, or framing the purpose of such a book in very lofty terms. But this is really about basic math, multiplying and dividing fractions. Again, this is bringing back bad memories for me of always being a bit of a laggard in math class. And so we have a sort of basic, math with fractions. We have some space here for illustrations, an illustration that was not completed, but as you'll see further on in the book, we have some wonderful illustrations that are what make this book kind of famous, at least among us here at Penn, one of our favorites, because it contains this really amazing variety of illustrations that are probably done by a non-professional illustrator of some kind. So, likely not the illuminator who did that very decorative frontispiece, but maybe Pier Paolo Buscarello himself. And here we have kind of, I guess you could say, images that that relate to the mathematical problem. I'm going to try to look up a few of these in the transcription, although the transcription is not in modern Italian, so it's a little bit difficult to read. I do speak and read modern Italian, but this 15th century sort of slightly regional variant of Italian used around Naples is sort of difficult to read. So here we are on folio 58R. And this is a problem that is talking about three masters who have to do work in 3 days. Wait a minute now. So 2 of them have to work for 3 days, and okay, well, it's a little complicated, but it's a sort of basically about their differential rates of working and pay over numerous days. And so you see them pictured here. They're kind of generically gesturing towards a hill town. And this goes on. We have some young men, young boys, adolescents here, measuring I guess, a town with different scientific instruments. So a square here, a plumb line. They seem to be looking, I'm not sure what these represent, if these are sort of pieces of parchment or maps or something, but this is about surveying. And these are all word problems that ask for answers, and they all kind of involve sort of different rates of sort of speed of work and so on. The earlier problems that are mostly unillustrated are largely about conversions between different currencies. And of course, this is very important in the 15th century, well, in any period really, but when we're dealing with currencies that are used throughout Europe that all have different kind of fractional values as they relate to each other and need to be converted. And so a lot of these mathematical problems in the first part of the book come from that. All right, so here we have, okay, 2 tailors contemplating 4 rolls of colored fabric, and there's a pair of scissors, shears really, hanging from a sort of rod here. And this is about different costs for different types of fabric. And you can see very vividly illustrated here. Okay, an old man with a money bag watched rapaciously by his two sons who will inherit. So, a clear sort of familial money problem, which is really interesting in the context of this book. A fashionably dressed merchant directing a peasant to dig a pile of clay. So it's kind of an interesting example of sort of labor history here. Clearly, this book is designed for use by people who are in the kind of wealthiest part of the kind of mercantile economy, sort of community, and so they are at sort of top of the artisanal pyramid, but they're not aristocrats, right? An aristocrat in the 15th century, right, would not be required to learn mathematics to this extent, right? This is still something that is seen as, well, this is made for people who need to work to make money. And of course, the great distinction in the pre-modern world is between those who must work for their money and those who don't have to work. And so these are all working problems, but of an ascendant, merchant class, particularly in the late 15th century in Italy, in this case, near Naples. A cat reaching up a fortified tower, a young man telling a seated prince about his survey of a fortified town. So we do get, I think earlier in the manuscript as well, some basic, trigonometry, geometry, different types of triangles, and so surveying, of course, is an important aspect of what the person using this book would be learning. Here, an old man dying in a bed as his lawyer drafts his will, and he's watched by a grieving wife, presumably with two newborn children. So again, mathematical problems relating to the division of a will in different fractions among different parties. Here we have, what do we have? We have a man fishing from rocks, a leafy tree. Some of these relate to kind of fractions of logs and other pieces of wood. Two men leading three donkeys up a very steep hill behind a town, a ship. Playing cards here. Great image. This image is described as a prince giving a fruit to a young suitor of his pretty daughter who looks out the window of her castle, and a man tapping a huge barrel and 3 jets of red wine running out. And so this is a problem about volumes and different rates of what that each spigot is pouring out, is releasing liquid at a different rate. This book is really interesting also for our historians like me, because it relates very closely to a lot of scholarship by a quite renowned art historian of the 20th century named Michael Baxendall, who wrote a lot about the kind of experience of 15th century painting, so painting and art in Renaissance Italy, and much of which was made for the merchant classes. And he talks about things like perspective and mathematical perspective as being related to knowledge that merchants had of mathematics, of geometry. And this book kind of very vividly illustrates some of those precepts. So it's very interesting in that regard. And also, though it's not, strictly speaking, a luxury book, it's very high end. I mean, it's produced for, and the fact that it survives means that it was, if it was used very carefully. We also have many books in our collection at Penn that are, and certainly in the Schoenberg collection, that show the kind of nitty gritty of use over many generations by many different pupils of sort of textbooks or commonplace books that had excerpts of works by classical authors with a lot of notes, a lot of messy handwriting. This book, though it's slightly worn, is still in pretty good condition. So this was not used repeatedly over centuries. And of course, soon after its production, we start getting printed textbooks for arithmetic and geometry. So those come to take the place of a bespoke product like this. This Pier Paolo Muscarello, we don't, as I said, we don't know much about him, but we could imagine that he was, that he may have been, you know, a tutor to the persons we presented this book to. Here we have geometry of circles before the kind of perfect knowledge of pi. So this is sort of an approximation of the kind of radius, diameter, circumference of circles. Then we have area, I mean, starting very simply with a rectangle with sides that are 2, these shorter sides and longer sides that are 3. This is not a, these aren't, this section goes from the word problems to explanations, and then shifts back to word problems. So like in a modern textbook, right, there's a section that explains a precept and then it's applied in sort of increasingly complicated ways. Someone said clearly the most worn pages are also the illustrated ones. That's an interesting comment, and that's often the case in illuminated manuscript books, whether that is strictly speaking where from those who use this book for its true purpose or from later users like, heaven forbid, us today. We kind of, even now, I'm gravitating towards the pages with illuminations. That's a good question, but yes, I mean, those images would have drawn us in. And of course, modern day textbooks, especially those for students at, you know, the middle school, high school, have illustrations. Not always, they don't always help explain the problem, but they help retain our attention.
Nick, there was another question about the justification of the text, and maybe you could say a little bit about how the pages are laid out.
Sure. So of course, in a manuscript, the justification is done on the fly in the sense that the scribe is writing and you know, can decide whether to you know, how to compress or have ligatures, you know, from one line to the next, or hyphenate the text. So that's how the justification appears so regular. And of course, this manuscript is ruled. It's very hard to see, but it's ruled in ink. Here's a better example. I hope you can see on the right. It is at least frame ruled. So we have ruling lines or sort of bounding lines at the top and bottom and at the sides. But we don't actually have ruling lines, the horizontal ruling lines for each line. So that's actually done freehand, which is unusual. Most medieval and early modern manuscripts have ruling lines for each line. And you can see, right, that the kind of cadence of the lines is slightly irregular. And then, of course, space is left for not just the illustrations, but these geometrical figures. And these are, one presumes, also done by Pier Paolo Muscarello. So, you know, these are maybe done, you might have returned to add these figures, or they might have been done, again, on the fly. And so we have, you know, calculating volumes of barrels, for example. You know, the volume of a mountain of grain. So I guess a kind of conical volumes of cones. What else? This is about sort of chimneys. What does this describe as? Just a minute. I do have to check my notes. There's so many images in this. Oh, an oven, right? So this is about ovens. And it's the volume of this oven, how many sort of inches tall it is, and how many feet, or how many feet and how many inches tall it is and how wide it is, and how thick it is and what its internal volume is. So the kind of internal volume of a walled cylinder. We have a lot about digging of clay and the volume of ceramic vessels as well. Garden, tower. So this is about measuring the heights of some towers from a distance. So yeah, a bit of trigonometry, I suppose. Better illustrations of that. Just a minute. Using a sextant to measure. Here we go. The height of a tower, I think, based on shadows. This one is interesting too. It shows a loom with the shuttle and the weaving of fabric. And I believe this question is at two different workers who weave different areas of fabric at different rates. And I think it's which one is faster. So this is, also about being able to judge and, select, I don't know, a provider of fabric who can do the work faster, right? If they're not giving you the rate in the same unit, to convert between units. So you can imagine how that could be applied to kind of the everyday business of a merchant. We have a few minutes left. I'm just going to look at haven't been monitoring the chat very much, and part of that's because I fear there's some mathematical questions that I will struggle to answer. So that's my fault, and I probably need a refresher. And I probably need to follow the course of the algorithms to refresh my mathematical skills. But just talking about the object as an object is wonderful because it shows us. It's just such a vivid snapshot of sort of origins of mercantile knowledge of mathematics, of course the adoption of Arabic numerals, which by the 1470s was it happened earlier in the 12th and 13th centuries, but of course this is mathematics that would have been unknown to the Roman world, to the classical world. So this is something that in the Renaissance, had to be drawn from a lot of Islamic writers, from Arabic texts, and we couldn't rely on the writer, the theoreticians of antiquity to provide sort of modern mathematics, of course, because these operations are not really possible in Roman numerals. Yes, fascinating mercantile math. Wonder if anyone who's watching who has more knowledge than I of sort of Renaissance mathematics would like to weigh in with anything.
I can share that
Yes.
this manuscript appears in a period between, say, the work of Fibonacci in the early 13th century, who was one of the first to popularize Arabic numerals in European calculation techniques. And then a couple of decades after this is made, Luca Pacioli has a very influential arithmetic book that summarizes all of these kinds of computational problems. Yeah.
And that's something that gets printed, of course, the Pacioli very widely, and sort of overtakes anything like this as a kind of standard textbook. And that, as I recall, is very, very specifically targeted at merchants, right? It's sort of almost advertised as something for
Correct.
useful.
They were the biggest market for arithmetic books.
Yeah.
They could also afford the books.
Yeah, interesting. Great. Well, if you're interested in the manuscript, in perhaps solving some of the word problems, I encourage you to look at the digitized version online, and also to consult the modern facsimile edition. And I will give you the reference. It's from 1972. It's mostly the transcriptions by Giorgio Chiarini, who was an Italian, a specialist in kind of early in Renaissance mathematics, and it also has a section on the kind of art history of it, on the context of Nola, the town in Italy, and it has a separate facsimile volume, which is less useful now because we have the digital images. But the main volume transcribes the whole text, word for word in Italian, and the arithmetic, the problems and the diagrams as well, not the illustrations, but the diagrams. So wonderful. We're at 12:30, so thank you all for attending. Please join us next week for same time, same place for Coffee with A Codex, and thank you for attending.